In this news roundup of a week for Friday 27th of May 2022. Russia starts making ground in the Ukraine war as parts of its military machine finally start working together. America endures another school mass shooting and descends into the usual internal warfare over guns. A hacker releases documents from Chinese police stations in Xinjiang showing just what's happening to the Uighurs. The UK introduces a post-Brexit bill to deregulate gene editing. And in this week's Short Thought, I talk about what it means to think for yourself. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. In Ukraine, reports are that Russia has started to get its act together militarily for perhaps the first time in this conflict, and it is making life much more difficult for defenders in the Donbass region. Ukrainian forces have been in steady retreat. One officer told the Times of London that they had been firing artillery at Russians from 9 miles away. Now that had constricted to 5 miles away. Better coordination between Russian ground forces and tank regiments and air cover means that they have been making solid progress. The more difficult situation was acknowledged by President Zelensky in his daily address, where he said this: "All the remaining strength of the Russian army is now concentrated on this region. The occupiers want to destroy everything there." Other signs of Russia's sharper tactical front included moving hundreds of Belarusian troops along the border with Ukraine to make it impossible for Ukraine to mobilise all its forces to concentrate in the Donbass. Up to 7 battalions of the Belarusian army are reported to have been set up to lurk menacingly. Even though Ukraine believes it's highly unlikely that they will actually invade, obviously you can't just ignore them. Otherwise they might indeed opportunistically do just that. So for Belarusia, it becomes an easy job. You don't have to fight, you don't have to invade, but you can still tie up enemy troops so that the Russians get a freer hand where the fighting is most intense. So far, Ukraine has responded by sending a territorial defence unit made up of fighters aged between 19 and their mid-60s. It's keeping its regular troops where they are most needed, but it can redeploy those troops within a couple of days should an invasion actually kick off. Meanwhile, as people look towards where things may go next and what the end game would be, a number of things are emerging. The former MI6 chief Sir Richard Dearlove said that Moscow is holding back on its cyber offensive capability, apparently waiting for the right moment to up the offensive against the West. He disclosed that he had been the target of a Russian cyber disruption operation, along with the former NATO Supreme Commander Admiral James Stavridis. Stavridis added that Russia had massive-scale, non-deniable cyber attacks which it hadn't yet mobilised, and they would most likely be used later in revenge for Western sanctions. In other words, as Russia begins to increasingly feel the pain of sanctions on its economy, it will seek to share a similar level of pain with the countries that it holds most responsible. Certainly, Russia will be seeking the early lifting of sanctions. We know this because we're seeing it already. So, for instance, this week it said that it would end the blockade of Ukraine's ports, currently keeping it from shipping what grain it has, around 22 million tonnes of wheat, if only the West would lift sanctions. They blame the West sanctions for the world food crisis, which is an audacious sleight of hand, you might say. But it's a foreshadow of the fact that Russia will be using whatever pressure can be brought to bear to get sanctions lifted, realistically only after the war has been brought to a conclusion. Its target scenario is clearly that it will succeed in taking territory, and then it will incentivise the West in accepting the new status quo and normalising relations in the name of restoring order to their own economies. Add to that the expectation that Putin will aim to do what he has done numerous times in the past, to split his opponents. In usual times, it is a reliable and relatively easy trick to pull off. In the future, it would likely come by offering a deal to Ukraine that involves the acceptance of a loss of territory and some degree of political autonomy, and to encourage the most temptable European nations, perhaps Germany, Italy and France, to lobby Ukraine to accept it against the wishes of, for instance, Poland, the UK and the US. That is a potential scenario which seems eminently achievable from where Putin is sitting. And it got a minor boost this week by the intervention of the veteran foreign policy player Henry Kissinger, speaking in Davos, who argued that Ukraine should be prepared to cede territory. So, achievable and maybe soon to become visible as the cracks begin to appear, however much Zelensky may rule the idea out. That's assuming Putin's health and his state of mind holds out, because it's the sort of end game that would be child's play for the old Putin, the patient, cunning Putin. It's just that that's not who we've been seeing over the last few months. Now, rational and patient minds have been in short supply in the United States this week, but for a change, for entirely understandable reasons. This week saw a tragic school shooting in Texas, a truly terrible death toll amongst young children and several adults, a horrible, awful event, something that will blight the lives of numerous families forever. Needless to say, America swiftly moved to its favourite pastime in such cases, which is arguing about guns. In practical terms, it's a waste of time. In political terms, of course, Democrats will be hoping that the disgust and shock and weariness in the population of this latest outrage will feed into political support for those who would bring in gun control, i.e. them. There are few things left that seem possible to avoid a major hammering in the coming midterm elections, so without downplaying the real sentiments people feel about the event itself, they will feel that they are honouring the victims by trying to use it to get a majority for themselves in the House. Biden rattled gun rights cages by making the sacrilegious statement that the Second Amendment is not absolute. His argument was that there had always been limitations as to the weaponry it might apply to, such as, when it was passed, you couldn't own a cannon. Which sounds compelling, except it's not true. There were no such restrictions in the early days of the Union. Of course, true or not, he might as well have said that the Constitution gave him the right to take the firstborn child of every American family. One Florida senator was quoted as repeating the oft-intoned threat when such topics come up: "Try to take our guns and you'll learn why the Second Amendment was written in the first place." Does it matter that historically this modern reading of the Second Amendment was layered onto an original that almost certainly was not intended to support that modern definition? Well, no. Not really. For one thing, the current Supreme Court would never overturn the current interpretation on gun rights, and secondly, it has become embedded as a major part of the culture of the United States. It has become one of the iconic points of difference between which the polarised political identities frame themselves. A history lesson doesn't even begin to address any of that. As an outside observer, a Brit, I can both think that it's bonkers that a country should fetishise gun ownership in such a way, but then I also look across foreign countries across the world, and all of them have some attitudes and customs that are alien to me. Doesn't mean I'm going to campaign to persuade those countries that they should change their ways, or to take sides on their internal debates on whether they should change their ways. I do, however, think it's odd. On Twitter, a number of Republicans, like Ted Cruz, went on demanding there should now be armed police defending all schools. We should have one easily defendable point of access. I have to say, when I envisage what it should look like to live in the land of the free, it's not quite the image that ever came to mind. But like it or not, it is the culture of the place. The United States has a gun culture. One of the consequences of that is that more of these things will happen there than happen elsewhere. Many gun advocates might argue that there are compensating benefits, such as higher home security for gun owners and so on, and maybe they're right. But it doesn't matter either way. The Senate is not going to pass gun control measures of any substance. Not only that, many Americans right now feel as though the place is deteriorating. As a result, gun ownership has been going up. They have never been so popular. Given the party polarisation on the issue, it seems unlikely the Democrats will be able to leverage it into retaining or building on their majority in the House in order to enable them to pass gun control measures. And if they did, they would probably be struck down as unconstitutional by the current Supreme Court. There are so many guns in the US that banning them wholly and completely, which is a political impossibility of course, would probably fail to prevent future shootings anyway. How many are there? 120 guns per 100 people, which is more than twice as many as the next country down, which is Yemen, a country which has been at war for 8 years, which comes in at just 53 per 100. So one of the only measures they can really take is much better monitoring and surveillance of people who might turn into shooters at some point in the future. More paranoid and intrusive scrutiny of citizens, which is also not something I thought was supposed to be associated with the land of the free. For now, America, the land of the free, has the freedom of the Wild West frontier. You can do what you want, but make sure you're in good shape to defend yourself from the people who might want to do you harm. It's a type of freedom, not for everyone, certainly preferred by some. It is at least still more freedom than others enjoy, for instance in China right now. This week saw the coordinated release of a batch of documents hacked from a Chinese police server in Xinjiang. A combination of internal documents and photographs, the documents gave a lot more detailed insight into the conditions that thousands of Uyghur Muslims are being held in. They confirmed that in spite of the Chinese government's insistence, Uyghurs are being held forcibly in the so-called re-education camps. Most of the photos showed fairly grim images of interactions with the authorities. 5,000 photos were of individual Uyghurs. When those photos were analysed, it was noted that they often displayed artefacts around the edges that are consistent with the use of Chinese image recognition software. The photos are rotated so that eyes are directly horizontal, which assists software mapping of the face for future recognition. So even once they are released, they will be easy to identify as they move around the cities that are full of surveillance cameras. They also recorded the reasons for their detention. So this 15-year-old girl who had been detained when she was just 14, she was in re-education in the Industrial Park VSETC Centre. Why? Basically guilt by association. She's the youngest daughter of a government official who was detained as part of Xinjiang's Strike Hard campaign. The files, numbered in the tens of thousands, came from computer systems operated by the Public Security Bureau from Kashgar and Ili prefectures. Some of the documents were confidential and included transcripts of internal speeches by local officials and national officials and detailed operation directives for the police. Various forms of verification were carried out on the documents. Outdoor photos have been geolocated using satellite images to confirm they were taken in the Uyghur camps. Phone numbers of Chinese police that were listed were checked to confirm that they actually belonged to the individuals that they were listed to. And the extensive documentation was checked for consistency with other known sources of information and for internal consistency. So, for instance, included was a fully unredacted document which in redacted form had already been collected from elsewhere. Along with the photos from inside the police stations that were highly sensitive, there were PowerPoint presentations to train police, for instance in the use of handcuffs, in close combat, or the search and arrest of suspects. The source of the documents could only have been the Chinese government. There were also several speeches from officials which are probably the most politically important. So one speech from Zhao Keiji, head of the national PSB, was probably the single biggest find, since it directly implicates the central government and Xi Jinping himself in the campaign for mass internment. Other speeches by Chen Quanguo urged that anyone who even attempts to escape should be shot dead, quoting the words of Xi Jinping that they should strike devastating blows and show absolutely no mercy. The absence of mercy could extend to when people could be let free. Chen also said in his speeches that detainees cannot be released because some may not necessarily have been transformed, the word for re-educated, well even after 3 or 5 years. The admission that re-education might not actually succeed in turning the subjects into docile citizens may well be why after 2018, which is the latest date of these documents, the region ended up at sentencing large numbers of re-education detainees to long prison terms. This release of documents largely confirms what we already knew, that Uighurs are held against their will on relatively arbitrary bases. They don't confirm, nor disprove, the more cutting claims. For instance, that inmates are tortured, that women are routinely and repeatedly raped, and that the overall treatment is such that could be classified as genocide. Such claims have, so far, tended to rely on the personal testimony of a very small number of eyewitness claims by former detainees who now live in the West. And while it could well be that every word they say is true, it's also the case that understandable hostility and resentment might lead such witnesses to exaggerate the more comprehensively damn the regime in the eyes of the world. I simply draw the distinction because genocide is a big word and one that I at least think shouldn't be misused just as an emphasizer when you want to stress how morally bad you think somebody is. Whether in Xinjiang or indeed in Ukraine, the word genocide doesn't need to be applied in order to make obvious atrocities sound even worse than they already are. That said, the atrocities described by that small number of individuals are the sorts of things that arguably would not be recorded in official records. So while noting that they are not proven by this leak, they are quite clearly not disproven either. In any case, it's a timely reminder that the immediate action taking place in Ukraine is not even the main focus right now when it comes to future geopolitical uncertainty. Now, in the UK, the main focus has been, once again, who drank what in what quantities in number 10 Downing Street, which dealt yet another cut to Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the death of 1,000 cuts that now seems like it may continue its downward spiral process all the way to the next election. So other things got less attention than perhaps they deserved. Case in point, this week saw the introduction of a gene editing bill to the UK Parliament, which is one practical reflection of a country's greater freedom to chart its own course post-Brexit. Because the EU is notably more averse to any sort of genetic modification, whereas most other jurisdictions have been happy to make a distinction between full-on genetic modification that brings in new genetic material from different organisms versus genetic editing techniques such as CRISPR, which do not do that. The UK bill is designed to enable innovation in the latter without the sort of onerous restrictions that have historically come with the former. Potential early uses could include mildew-resistant tomatoes, which could then cut the use of fungicides, as well as livestock which is more resistant to disease and not in need of the use of antibiotics. A lot of other factors are being targeted in the research, including adaptation to climate change with more drought-resistant plants, and so on. The new legislation would allow such new products to be approved in 1 year, instead of up to 10 years at the moment. And given that the gene editing does not involve introducing genetic material from outside the animal or plant concerned, the government contends that such products don't need to be specially labelled for consumers. A number of the country's scientists have welcomed the bill, obviously those connected with commercial entities, but also others. So Professor Andrew Thompson, head of Cranfield University's Soil and Agri-Food Institute, he said this: GMO technology from the 1980s has allowed us to create crop plants that use water more efficiently, generating more crop per drop, vital where crop production is limited by water availability. These advances have had limited traction under the GMO regulatory system. More precise gene editing technologies, alongside a simpler regulatory regime proposed in the Genetic Technology Bill, will certainly help such advances to be fully exploited for the benefit of farmers, consumers, and the environment. Of course, and inevitably, not everyone's a fan, and those most upset at the initiative are the traditional environmentalists, whose adherence to the precautionary principle tends to weigh against any such initiative. So, for instance, the UK's organic farming organisation, the Soil Association, said this: "We are deeply disappointed to see the government prioritising unpopular technologies rather than focusing on the real issues: unhealthy diets, a lack of crop diversity, farm animal overcrowding, and the steep decline in beneficial insects who can eat pests. Instead of trying to change the DNA of highly stressed animals and monoculture crops to make them temporarily immune to disease, we should be investing in solutions that deal with the cause of disease and pests in the first place." The Soil Association is onto a difficult ask here, since its preferred solutions produce a reduced yield from agriculture, and of course right now we have a looming food crisis. Indeed, the EU's plan to move 25% of its agricultural land to the sort of organic production the Soil Association promotes is its single biggest controversial position, given the geopolitics of the moment. It does, of course, have a point, that simply enabling such technology doesn't in itself fix some of the key issues. The challenge we have with animals kept in conditions that are currently unviable unless they're dosed with antibiotics. It's a process which builds antibiotic resistance amongst bugs we'd rather didn't have such resistance, but finding the optimal solutions is a practical problem to be solved. And that becomes easier if you don't, for ideological reasons, close off some of your options. At least that's the argument behind the bill. Now, the rest of the world isn't standing still while Britain is doing this. Professor Maurice Maloney of Agri-Tech Knowledge said this: "Moving modern breeding techniques into UK law is way overdue, but it was impossible under EU Commission rules. It is a tangible example of how Brexit can deliver positive opportunities. However, moving forward with rational science-based policies is urgent. North and South America are already there, China and India are now enacting new laws, and the EU will revisit their 2018 ruling, which was against their own legal advice, soon. In other words, the UK is giving itself the opportunity to enter an already crowded race. It's not guaranteeing itself a leadership position." Lots of people, especially Conservatives, have been complaining that the government has failed to take advantage of its Brexit revolution. This at least is one area where speedy action does seem to be taking place. And probably in an area that wouldn't be just reversed, should there be a change of government at the next election, which seems a possibility at least. Lots of people in the independent media extol the virtue of thinking for yourself. Obviously, I'm a fan of the principle. I wanted to focus briefly on one of the key tells for thinking for yourself, and conversely the tell for failing to do exactly that. The key to thinking for yourself is to be specific. Generalizations are easy, often based on presumptions that are unspoken and untestable, and as such they do not count as productive thinking. So specific, and that leads them to being testable. They should come with factual corroboration and or a logical argument drawing from the propositions. Now, I mention this because I've just covered a couple of topics: the proposed pandemic treaty, the World Economic Forum, that tends to bring out a lot of the non-specific, sweeping and totally confident assertions. Things like this one referring to the concept of stakeholder capitalism as favoured by Klaus Schwab. I have come to understand it's about a new way of control, and it's so obvious it baffles me how Mallen doesn't seem to see this. Or maybe he does. Do you like that final touch? Ooh, how can Mallen possibly miss this thing that's so obvious that I somehow struggle to articulate it? He must be in on it. Now, it's perfectly possible to be specific and accurate about how stakeholder capitalism is defined. The trick is not to stop with the excitable political commentators. People with strong opinions on whichever side are rarely the most reliable narrators. But instead, do a simple search and go to the original source. Where does the idea come from? What does it say? But if you look at what we ended up with in the case of my commenter, you see the problem. A new way of control. My specific brain is looking at all the pre-filled gaps there. Control of what? By whom? To what end? Prod a little further and you'll get a roll of the eyes to say, how could you be so naive and stupid? Control by them, of us, to the end of world domination. Them. Thank you. That's so much clearer now. Ambiguity, where the viewer is invited to fill in the gaps, is a classic tool of manipulative persuasion. Your them might be completely different to someone else's them, but both of you can project the bad things onto them and find common cause with each other, oblivious to the fact that you're thinking of totally different people. This commenter has clearly been influenced by such persuasion. What they are not doing is thinking for themselves, because that doesn't look like repeating slogans. Whenever you see a claim, go to the source. And whenever you see a claim, disentangle factual statements from value judgments. So later in the discussion, that same commenter made a number of statements and then added, do I have proof of this? No. Just a basic understanding of history and propaganda. Well, people who have a basic understanding of history are able to give concrete factual examples from history. That's the superpower you gain from having an understanding of history. What that shouldn't be mistaken for is simply a gut instinct for a topic that you've not researched based on your prior beliefs. It's not my purpose in saying all of this to mock people for falling for the highly compelling, generalised, values-laden messages that tell you what to think about things. They are widespread because they are seductive. Smart people fall for them, good-hearted people fall for them. It is genuinely hard to do this stuff. Which is why there are 20 channels with big audiences doing hot takes on things they don't know much about for every one of us that's trying to work out what's really true. I'm just trying to give a simple tool to start the process. That thing you believe, is it true? Well, go to the original source. A simple Google search is usually enough. That thing you fear about them, well, first of all, who is them? Let's put names on them. What evidence from their life, from the writing of people who know them well, is there for how they really think? Is there really a homogeneous them? I mean, usually we see individual variation in our own group, our own side, but we presume the out group, the other side, are all the same. That's another tell. You don't need to be an ace researcher. You just need to look for specific statements and notice when people are only offering you broad generalizations. All right, just time for me to thank, as always, the good people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not spend the time that I do researching and producing these videos without that support. I say it every week because there's never a week when it's not true. If you value the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, to the degree that you would like to help me make it happen, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.